So welcome everyone. Thanks for spending a bit of time with us today. We've got an hour booked in your diaries. I'm conscious that that's quite a bit of time, so we're going to try to use that time as much as possible to fill you with some valuable insight that you can take away. My name is Will Lytle. I am our COO here at Plandek, looking after a lot of our client relationships and our new business relationships. My background is very delivery focused. So, prior to Plandek, I spent years working in various roles within software delivery. And that background, that history really stays very true in the way that we develop our customer relationships and support our customers today. I'm very happy to be joined by Pranav. Do you want to introduce yourself to the group, Pranav?
Yes, thank you so much, Will. Hi, guys. I'm Pranav Lakhotia. I'm the head of the customer insights and advisory team here at Plandek. So working really closely with Will and really closely with all of our customers to help them get the most out of Plandek, ensure that they are seeing good value and talking to them about what good looks like and what they should be looking for within these metrics. And similar to Will, my background is very delivery focused as well. Prior to joining Plandek, was working in various delivery roles across this SDLC. So yeah, that's the kind of lens that we do take when we speak with our clients in terms of advising them and what they should really be looking for when they look at metrics on Plandek. So yeah, good to speak to you all today.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pranav. And Pranav didn't mention it was him and his team that actually spent a lot of time pulling together all the data and the insights and putting together the benchmarks for 2025. So it was only fitting that he joins us today and presents it to the group. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We would love for this to be a fairly interactive session. So we're going to keep a very close eye on the questions area. So if you do have a question at any point in time, do please feel free to raise a question. We'll keep a close eye on it. We'll try to answer questions as we go along to make sure that it's staying in line with the content. Pranav and I are going to kind of co-present today, and it'll be a little bit more conversational, going through some of the key points, some of the observations, surprises that we had, not surprises that we saw in the data, and kind of walk through, both in terms of introducing the productivity framework to everyone, as well as going through the specific benchmarks. Sorry, the light's going off in this thing. Of course it has. And walk through everything, and then we're going to finish up with some key takeaways. So things that, there's a few things that Pranav's seen and I've seen that we think everyone should be thinking about and taking away as you get back to your teams and working with your teams. So without any further ado, let me start with a little bit of the background. So about 12 months ago, we launched our original version of the benchmarks, and these were focused on 6 core areas: lead time to value, so the time it takes from idea to production for us to deliver value to our customers; cycle time, which is a subset of that, so it's development start to production; sprint target completion, which is really around understanding how effectively teams can plan and execute 2 weeks of work, or 3 weeks if you have 3-week sprints; time to merge PRs as an essential part of the engineering process to get code from essentially developer ready through to the review, approval, and merge process, so it's ready to be deployed into your environments. And then we did a story to defect ratio as well as bug resolution time. And I think what we found with these is they were incredibly impactful for a lot of organizations in terms of just focusing attention on some of the core areas to measure around the SDLC and delivering value to customers. Over the last year, though, productivity as a theme has picked up more and more traction. And there's a number of reasons for this, but I think principally driven by, kind of what's happening outside of engineering, which is, in the sense that the cost of capital, the age of free money is no longer as it used to be. And so there's a lot more focus across the business, but in particularly in technology and R&D around, how do we maximize the investment that we're putting into technology? How do we ensure that our customers are getting as much value as possible? And ultimately the businesses are getting good value for money. So all of this is put a real focus on technology and the concept of productivity. But software engineering is not manufacturing. We like to talk about the Kanban process and compare it to car manufacturing, but it really isn't. It's not because we don't benefit from the ability to measure cars that are coming out at the end of a day or the end of a week or end of a month. A lot of what we do is we work in data points that are virtual, right? So we aren't able to see waste potentially sitting on the shelves that are not being utilized and delivered to our customers. It's all happening in a virtual world. So how do we start to think about and measure productivity And as a result of that, we wanted to then update our benchmarks to incorporate our current thinking. So today we're going to start off with thinking about productivity. What is a useful framework to think about productivity, and what are the metrics that help us focus our attentions on how we're driving that? And then we'll go into some of the benchmarks, what we're seeing, some of the trends. We'll go through, explain each one of the benchmarks themselves, and then have a wrap up at the end. So again, feel free to drop a question as we go along in the Q&A. We'll respond to those. But let's get started. So Pranav, if you want to share your screen, thank you very much. So before we jump into the framework, we thought this was a really good place to start. When we think about, what does an efficient delivery organization actually look like? What does that actually mean? Because it's not about counting throughput. It's not about your velocity. It's far more sophisticated than that. So the way that we like to start to think about this, and you might argue it's overly simplistic, but I think its beauty lies in its simplicity. If you imagine, with most organizations, you start off with an engineering capacity that is unused, right? And there might be some essential planned work that you need to focus on. So this could be technical debt, or if you're working in banking or the regulated industries, you could find yourself spending a portion of this time focused on compliance and regulatory work. But essentially, just right off the bat, there's a certain proportion of your engineering capacity that you need to dedicate towards these things. And then from there, it's really about mitigating two particular areas. One is unplanned work, and the other is inefficiencies. So with unplanned work, and I'm not saying that we don't plan for this type of work, but ultimately at the end of the day, we make some assumptions in the way that we run our technology businesses, the way that we deliver programs around this sort of quote unquote unplanned work. So it could be your bug backlog or your defect backlog or incidents that are coming through. There's an idea of which we know we're going to reserve 20% or 30% of that capacity for that type of work. But then it's on how you actually deal with that work. Right. So we think about things like, a bug that sits in the backlog for a month is going to take an engineer a lot longer than it does for that engineer if they're going to respond to it straight away. They have to remember what the original context was of the change that created that bug potentially in the first place. They also have to consider what else has changed in the code base that's going to influence how they then fix this bug now. And all of that is kind of wrapped up in time. And so it's not only the fact that you need to work on these bugs, but it's how much time you actually commit to and dedicate to resolving these bugs. And if you have the opportunity to resolve them straight away, you're going to have a lot more time left over to focus on your roadmap than you would if you let them sit in the backlog for a longer period of time. So that's a kind of an explanation of the unplanned work side. Inefficiencies, I think, is everyone's quite familiar with, and we'll go into some of the details around this. This is really around how we work. How do we collaborate as a team? What is the kind of, when we think about the efficiency of the process and the collaboration between different actors in our team, how effective are we at actually able getting from an idea to production, or from the development start process into production? And this is a combination of human interactions as well as potential automation and continuous deployment that allows us to reduce these inefficiencies and ultimately speed up our value delivery to production. The result of this in reality is what we actually have remaining for roadmap capacity. And I think the problem that many of us probably incurred at some point in our careers is we started off with, capacity for roadmap is the thing that we want to focus on. And then as the end, the other factors ahead of that actually eat away at it. But when you think about it, these are the other, the essential work, the unplanned work, the inefficiencies. This is actually, if you forward plan and think about it from this model, you'll understand what you actually ultimately have in reality left for roadmap delivery. So productivity in some ways is thinking about, well, how can we actually maximize the amount of capacity that we have to delivering value for our customers? Okay. So with that in mind, if we want to go to the next slide here, we started thinking about what are the core pillars, not only that are going to be operationally very useful for teams, but also things that can be communicated up through the organization. What are the kind of key pillars that help drive productivity within software delivery? And so over the last years, we've gone through a number of different iterations, and thinking of this, we've landed on these four, which I think are really kind of core to how teams work and how we deliver value for our customers. Number one is around focus. Very simply put, are we focused on the right things? Are we focused on things that are going to deliver value for our customers? Are we mitigating time that's being spent in other areas that are not strategically of importance for our business? So having a good sense of are we focused on the right things, and are we working in focused ways is really important. Speed, it kind of is what it says in the tin, right? It's the efficiency in which you deliver, how quickly you can get value to your customers, how quickly you can respond. And we'll go through some metrics that sit within that particular area. Predictability, it's not about predicting the future as such, but it's actually working in predictable ways so that actually you have a better chance at predicting the future. So some of this can be very Scrum based, but doesn't necessarily need to be. There are ways in which you can translate some of these factors into more Kanban or lean ways of working. But essentially, it's what is our organizational's capability of being able to plan and deliver as in a consistent and predictable fashion. Okay, this is absolutely critical because I think as most CTO or technology leaders would agree, the easiest way to lose credibility as a technology organization is an inability to meet your commitments, right? So the better chance you have at being able to plan and execute 2 weeks of work or 3 weeks of work or 1 week of work, that all aggregates up into the sort of outcomes of being able to hit consistently your milestones from a quarterly basis or from a roadmap basis. It allows technology not only to be a strategic enabler, but actually to fit into the business plans that enable that strategic growth within businesses. And then lastly is quality. And the way that we think about quality isn't just limited to the customer experience. Obviously, having good quality products and having secure products in production is of critical importance. But it's also about how do you use the capacity that you have. So if I go back to the example that I previously gave when we spoke about unplanned work and bugs and defects, exactly, thank you. We spoke about, you have the opportunity, when bugs are created in your backlog, there's always a difficult decision, do we focus on cleaning up these bugs? Do we focus on the next story or the next bit of value that we want to deliver to our customers? Oftentimes the story wins, the feature wins, because most of the focus is going to be on there. What we're trying to talk to our customers more and more about and getting more teams to think about is the actual cost of those P3 defects, of those P4 defects, the ones that naturally aren't as important individually as maybe that new feature would be. But when you consider it from a cost perspective, the longer that those spend in the backlog, right, you eventually are going to resolve them. You are going to pay them down, but you might do so at a higher cost. A higher cost, technically speaking, in terms of it will take more time for an engineer to fix those, but that time also then takes away from your total capacity to be able to focus on new value. So it's trying to find an equilibrium and a balance between, yes, we do want to make sure that we're focused on the continuous delivery of value to our customers, but also being mindful that the decisions that we make when it relates to your bug backlogs and your defects also does have an impact on that future capacity that you're going to have over the course of a quarter or a half year or a full year. Okay, so that is the productivity framework in a nutshell. And then what I'll do is, we'll jump into the next bit here. So we're going to spend a bit of time next going through each one of these metrics in detail. We'll talk about a little bit what it is, why we think it matters. We'll go through and we'll talk a little bit about some of the insights. We'll actually pull up the benchmarks so you can see some of the data points there as we go through each one. But this just gives you a kind of a full set of the menu that we're going to be looking at today. So from focus, looking at things like the proportion of time that you're spending on planned work, your average max WIP per assignee to understand kind of what is the capability of individuals within your organization or within your team, within the systems that you're working to be able to maintain focus on particular deliverables, as well as what we call context switching, or basically how many kind of key initiatives do you have in delivery at the same time. And those kind of underpin the focus pillar. From speed, a lot of familiar metrics that folks will notice. So lead time to value is naturally something that we bring forward from our 2024 benchmarks, equally with cycle time and time to merge PRs. What we've included this year, which is really quite essential, is your time to deploy. So it's all well and good merging these PRs, but actually then how long does it take for us to ship this and get this into customers' hands? That's an essential data point in understanding the more automation and continuous delivery aspect of your pipeline, as well as your merge frequency per author per week, right? And this gives you some indications essentially of actually what is the distribution of participation and what does that participation say in terms of potentially the size of the PRs or the frequency of which the PRs, because there's a lot of things that we can start to glean and understand from that. Predictability, we've of course included sprint target completion, but two things that we've added to the group this year is around our sprint capacity accuracy, which we'll go into and explain that in a little bit more detail in a bit, as well as scope change. So this is obviously for anybody who's worked with a Scrum team in the past, your ability to plan is really critical, but your ability to maintain that scope over the course of the 2 weeks with minimal disruptions, there'll always be some, but trying to minimize that and keep the goalposts stable is going to lead to a better chance of success not only with that sprint, but then you aggregate all those sprints across multiple teams across a quarter, and that's going to result in positive outcomes in terms of your commitments into your business. And then lastly, with quality, so bug resolution time still remains. Our story to bugs ratio is still there, but we added a new one this year, which is bugs resolved to bugs raised. And we'll talk a little bit more detail why we think this is important. So I will hand over to Pranav now to give us a better sense of, he'll walk us through the focus metrics, and we'll go from there.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Will. So guys, like Will mentioned, focus is a key part of the productivity pillar. And the reason why we sort of include this in is, of course, you want to make sure that you're working on the right things. You're working on the highest priority items that will lead to the best business outcomes. Now, out of this, apart from that, is the key thing to understand as well is to ensure that you're working on as much planned work as possible. Now, when we say planned work, it doesn't mean just roadmap items. It could be things like from when we had seen the where your engineering time goes. It could also be things like compliance work that you might have to do depending on the industry you're working on, any essential maintenance work, etc. But also any technical debt. So Will was talking about bug resolution times and how you might, start thinking about the P3s and the P4s slightly differently because they do add up. If you do let them go for a very long time, they do add up, and ultimately you will have to pay those down at some point in time. So thinking about those as important technical debt that you do need to resolve can also go into sort of the planned work side of things. When we looked at the metrics, from our customers, there's ways that you can start to define what planned work is. But when we did the analysis, we were mainly looking at the ticket types, and 85% of all your work, above 85%, is what you should be aiming for. So this is something which is important to think about, so start looking at how much time you're spending on any unplanned work, etc. And that's how, you should start thinking about this. And on the other end of the scale, if you're below 50%, then there's more sort of work to be done, maybe reworking the processes, understanding exactly what's happening and why it's so low, for instance. Okay. The average max WIP per assignee. So no one likes to work on too many things at the same time, right? So that's something which is very critical to think about as well. Like if you're constantly having to work on multiple different things, you are likely ending up in more context switching scenarios, which will mean that you will end up taking a lot longer to finish everything at any given time. So when we say trying to make it sure that at any given time, during a sprint, for example, say the first 2 or 3 days, you don't have more than 2 tickets assigned per assignee, then that's something which you also do have to think about. On the other end of the scale, of course, if you have more than 5, then there's sort of more problems as such, like you will end up being quite slow in various different things. And not be able to complete everything in any given time. So trying to reduce the amount of work in progress is always very, very important. Now, looking at it from a more team perspective is where we're looking at context switching. Okay, so context switching, again, it's similar to the average max WIP per assignee, but this is more from a team perspective. Now, these numbers can vary depending on the size of the team that you have. But for a team which is, say, of six engineers and two testers, and you have maybe a scrum master within them, we say that at any given time you should be looking to work on under 2.5 epics concurrently. So what we've seen in the data is that a lot of teams tend to have a lot of things in flight at the same time. Now, again, as you can imagine, if you are constantly switching the context between these epics, it does become a problem. And having all of that will sort of lead to a scenario where you're working very slow across all of them. So identify what is the 2 or 3 key epics that you do need to work upon. Try and work on those first, get through those, and then start to move on the other ones. So at any given time, try and reduce the amount of context switching that your team members need to do by staying focused on the smaller number of epics and the right number of epics. One thing to kind of mention here as well is, bucket epics. Quite often we would see this in the data, and we're quite surprised to see this as well, to be honest, where there's a lot of teams who would just have, long-running epics, which are just sort of bucket epics of different tickets. These are not very good. It's something which you should try and avoid. So try and reduce the amount of bucket epics that people might have. Moving on to the speed side of things. Did you want to cover this one on the
Yeah,
speed?
that's great. Thanks. So lead time to value is essential because, ultimately when you think about why we adopt agile practices, it's all about delivering value as iteratively and quickly as we can to our customers. And lead time to value does um, better, I would say, than any metric at giving you a high level indicator in terms of the time it takes to deliver this. So this is all the way from idea to production. Um, Now, naturally, this is a pretty large number, and so to really action parts of this, you want to dissect it and drop into certain subsets of this data, which is relevant in cycle time and time to merge PRs, which we'll go into in a second. But what we can see and what we've seen a little bit trending since last year is the top quartile of teams in this particular space are getting better, while the bottom quartile of teams are kind of continuing to stay a little bit stagnant. And so what that's indicating to us, and I think the industry broadly has seen a lot of these trends as well, is that teams that tend to be particularly engaged in thinking around this data, how they're delivering, how they're working, are continuing to optimize how they work and how they deliver statistically, and that's backed up by the mass itself. Whereas the sort of bottom quartile of teams, removing anybody who's sort of blocked by working in applications that may have far, far fewer frequency of deployments, gives you the ability to understand, sorry, this just popped up there. The lead time to value gives you, confidence in the fact that, by looking at this data, you're able to actually come through and deliver more effectively to your clients. Cycle time is a subset of that, and this is really kind of pure within the engineering space. Okay, so this is indicative of development start all the way to getting things into production. And what's impressive here is around the top quartile. They still remain quite significantly ahead of their counterparts, and the upper mid as well. I think one thing that I've noticed around the cycle time, which is something worth keeping an eye on, when you think about the majority of teams that we come across are naturally Scrum teams. I think largely across the market, there's more of a tendency to lean more towards Scrum than more towards Kanban, and there are a number of reasons for that. I think Kanban tends to lend itself much more high-performing, mature teams, whereas Scrum can provide a good set of structure around teams that are still developing ways of working and understanding how to work effectively as a group together. Within that cohort, though, what I think is very interesting is you'll notice, essentially, if you think about the average tickets they're working on in a 2-week period of time, only 50% of the people actually are working to deliver things reasonably within the averages of what you would expect within a sprint. So a sprint, you've got 2 weeks of time. If you take, some things take a long time, some things take fewer time, they average out to be about 5 to 6 days within a particular sprint. So even though the far majority of teams are still working within Scrum, only about 50% of the teams that we see at Plandek are actually delivering within the confines of that particular sprint. That's interesting because that can lead to either a lot of work being spilled into following sprints, or that you're missing your targets if you're deploying on even if you're deploying on a sprint by sprint basis, let alone more frequently than that, chances are you're missing those opportunities to deploy every other sprint as well. Time to merge PRs. This is probably one of the things that's moved the largest since last year when we published this. So last year, the top quartile was less than 20 hours. This year, it's less than 15 hours. Again, along with lead time to value, we've seen something similar, is that the teams that are engaging a lot with this data tend to be moving into the top quartile and actually driving that down. So there's a lot of focus on collaboration and automation across teams. I think some of the metrics as we go into them, we'll start to kind of pinpoint questions around, are we breaking down stories enough? Are we breaking down contributions to code small enough? Are we being responsive and collaborating very effectively in how we work as an engineering team? I think the combination of all those are leading to what we're seeing here around the reduction in overall time to merge PRs. Whereas the bottom quartile is roughly staying the same. Okay, so we've not really seen any movement. Teams that are a little bit slower continue to maintain slowness, but teams that are improving are actually distancing themselves from their peer group. Time to deploy. So this is going to be a very broad spectrum of different tools, different data points here, because some teams will be very well set up to have automation testing and deployment into their pipelines built. And so the top quartile, having less than 10 hours between something being merged and actually deployed into production is quite impressive. And that really reflects kind of the investment that teams have made over the last year in automation and continuous delivery. Whereas obviously the bottom quartile, that's looking at over basically 9 days, or no, this sort of 9 days, or just 8 days roughly, let's call it 8 days, right? 8 days to get PRs into production is much more reflective in teams that not yet have invested enough into that automation and continuous delivery, or perhaps are working in industries where continuous delivery is just not a practical solution for them. And then merge frequency per author. So this gives you a general sense around the amount of PRs that we're seeing broadly across our customer base. So again, in the top quartile, you'll see about 2.5 PRs per author per week. Whereas in the bottom part, you'll see just fewer than 1. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Because you might have certain individuals in your teams that might be playing more of a supporting role for other developers. And so you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be merging as many PRs. And there's different ways of being able to look at that in the Plandek data to kind of be able to see our people's data points reflecting the time of role and expectations we expect them to have, or the contribution that they're making to the teams overall. But this is very interesting in the sense that what we see is the kind of top performing teams or top performing contributors in those teams are really contributing about 2 times as much from a pure PR perspective than say the bottom quartile itself. So on the predictability side, I'll hand back to Pranav to walk us through the next part.
Yes, thank you. Before we jump into that, I just there's a few questions on the chat which I just wanted to cover. So the first one from Murtaza, how do you resolve work in progress with multiple individuals? That's an interesting one. Typically you'd, I guess one of the, and Will, please chime in here as well, is more about maybe breaking that down even smaller into individual tasks here, Murtaza, as that's probably a way that you can potentially do that to ensure that people are still just working on a minimal number of tickets. Ideally, you don't want multiple people working on the same thing. But if you do have if you have a large story, for example, you should definitely break that down. We always say that never bring in anything. Obviously, story points differ from team to team, from company to company, but what we do at Plandek here is that we will never bring in a particular user story which is more than 8 story points, and even an 8 story pointer is only brought in in any exceptional circumstances. So that's maybe a good way to try and think about this, is to try and reduce that, break those little tickets down, and ensure that you're working on very small pieces of work.
Yeah, I think the only thing to think about as well there is, what WIP is looking at is it's not looking at multiple people working on one ticket. It's basically how many tickets am I as an individual working on. So if I'm in theory working on 3 things at the same time, it's going to be far less effective or far less efficient for me than if I were to work on one thing, then go to the next thing, then go to the next thing, right? It's really capturing the kind of context switching and the impact that context switching is shown to have in many business contexts, not just software delivery, on overall efficiency and productivity. So that's one thing to think about there. The next one, which I think is actually a really good question to ask, is for teams who have a fixed delivery schedule of release, like a monthly or quarterly releases, how to define lead and cycle time to our advantage. So this is a really important question. I think one that we speak to a lot of customers about, because I think the instinct of a team is, well, once we're done with the development side and it's gone through QA and passed, there's nothing more that we can do. We're not going to release it for another month or another quarter or maybe even another year. So why should that time be counted against our cycle time? I would challenge that for 2 reasons. One is, ultimately at the end of the day, your ability to deliver is measured not by the engineering team, but by your customer, right? So if your customer is, seeing that you're delivering something once every 3 months or once every 6 months, that is the reality that's going to drive your business. It's what's going to drive your customer satisfaction. It's what's going to drive the engagement with the product. And that's the reality of it. So one, I would always recommend that teams continue to kind of show the full truth. What is the reality of how long? Because if you're sitting there on a quarterly release cycle, and yet you're telling your business and your customers, yeah, but it only takes us 5 days to deliver value, those 2 things don't resonate at all. And you're going to lose credibility quite quickly in the conversation. The other thing, which I think teams are really dying for, is teams want to be able to continuously deploy. They want that feedback. They want to be able to iterate. Nobody wants to work on these massive releases that have huge quality risks and huge risks just generally in terms of the size of the releases. And so being able to have this data there and being able to show to your business to help you to build the business case as to why do we need to invest in automation and to automation tools and pipeline. What do we need to invest in the space to help us achieve, and maybe not the ultimate nirvana of continuous delivery, because I do appreciate there are some industries that where this isn't practical, but I do think it's an important part of the story to be able to express, not just to yourselves but also to other stakeholders, and then get that buy-in to, hey, we could deliver in 5 days. Right now we deliver in 21 days. because of the complexity we face with the monthly releases. But we could actually collapse that quite significantly if we invest in X, Y, and Z. And that then has been proven. We won't go into it here, but I mean, you read the Accelerate book all you want. The faster delivery cycles do have unequivocal positive impacts on business outcomes. So there's a lot written in that space to help you tie those narratives together.
I think, yeah, just to reiterate a little bit on the risk point that Will mentioned, it's, larger releases inherently carry a lot more risk with them. You have to go through more testing cycles. You have to ensure regression testing is done a lot, be more tight on the regression testing as well, as to ensure that nothing breaks when you do go live into production. So trying to reach that state where you have at least more regular releases and that are sooner than monthly or quarterly as well can really help you reduce that risk and ultimately respond to any adverse issues a lot faster. Moving on to Corey's question around how are teams improving. It's actually a combination of all of these, from what we are seeing. Like predominantly it's the process side of things, because the process is what is going to drive productivity. You improve your processes in terms of ensuring you're removing any bottlenecks in your process. If you see that your tickets are sitting in a ready for QA status for a very long time, then you know that, hey, there is a problem that maybe we don't have enough automated testing. So remove those little bottlenecks and that will start to improve things. Tools, of course, automated testing kind of comes into that. And a drive from the leadership definitely does help with these kind of things as well. What systems and support resources do you offer employees to deliver this type of interesting job culture as do you want to take this, Will?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, Michelle, right? There's a lot that you need to invest in multiple areas. I mean, Plandek as a tool helps teams to really identify and look at different aspects of the SDLC to spot exactly where they might be facing challenges and being able to then turn those into action, which we'll kind of cover a little bit of that in a little bit. I do agree with you that there's a lot of other factors that you want to invest in terms of surveys, constant feedback from your developers and from your teams and how things are working. So I don't think that there's a sort of silver bullet. I don't think that these metrics in itself, without anything other sort of investment contributed to it, will ultimately drive productivity. But what I do think is productivity at the end of the day, if you're trying to distill what is productivity in engineering and how do we measure it, right? This is a very useful start and a framework and a set of benchmarks that you can look at to think, okay, well, we all want to be focused on the right things. We all want to drive work as efficiently as possible. We all want to drive good predictability. We always want to maintain quality. These are 4 very good starting points for that. So I agree with you on the point that there's definitely more that you need to factor into the human resource or capital. I think our position here with Plandek is this is one of the tools that you have in a toolbox to start to engage teams and engage organizations around what are the things that really drive productivity, and giving you really actionable data points to be able to make decisions on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis that improves ultimately how you deliver value to your customers.
On Tim's question, Tim, yes. So a status of ready before development should start. That would count as part of your lead time. However, that doesn't count as part of your cycle time. So a very sort of simple thing over there. Cycle time is as soon as something goes into progress, typically within a sprint, or if you're a Kanban team, as soon as you move a ticket from ready to in progress. Whereas lead time, you do have to count that as well. Like how long things stay in a ready status is an important factor of lead time to value. Depends on the kind of team that you're working in. If you're working in more of a sort of maintenance side of things, then you would typically see this being quite small and quite low. But if you have a well-defined backlog where things are ready, then this could be a little bit longer. But that's not necessarily a bad thing as such.
And one last question, then we'll get back to the presentation. Delighted to have all this Q&A, by the way, but just also conscious of time. So keep them coming. We'll definitely come back to them as we go along. So Anonymous has asked, when you say buckets of work can be bad, what framework or solution do you have for buckets of work like technical debt or maintenance might fall into? So I think which buckets you define is going to be somewhat relative to your industry that you work in. So for instance, if you're working in banking or finance, you're going to have a pretty important bucket around regulatory or compliance work that maybe, Plandek, for instance, when we look at this data, we don't necessarily have any compliance or regulatory work, or at least not the same type that you would have in financial services. So I think part of that needs to be considered for yourself. But for instance, what we use here at Plandek, when we think about our investment categories and where the distribution of our work is going, then we use roadmap work, so things that are kind of clearly delivering sort of client-facing value to our customers. We use technical debt, and it's not that technical debt doesn't deliver value, but it's a sort of indirect value in terms of the scalability, performance, and other aspects of the platform, which ultimately our customers do benefit. We also then have a kind of a support and maintenance side of it as well. And then we track personally a client escalation category as well. So we like to keep track of making sure that we have capacity always reserved to be able to react to important customer demand, but also then keep an eye on how much are we actually spending in that area, making sure that we're not underinvesting or overinvesting at the consequence, say our roadmap itself, because we've lots of clients with lots of great feedback, and it's very easy for us to follow that entirely and actually kind of lose track of the roadmap. So for us, it's finding the balance between those four things. Okay. Predictability. Pranav, do you want to take that?
Yeah, let's get back to this. Okay, so predictability, like Will mentioned when he was talking about the framework, predictability is ensuring that you're working as consistently as possible. And we have three measures to sort of help you define that. The top one you see here is sprint capacity accuracy. It's a little bit of a strange one to try and understand, but it's once you get your head around it, it's quite simple. Over here, what we mean is if you look at your sprint completion rates, typically you will calculate that as velocity divided by commitment. Now, you can think of velocity and commitment in two different ways. In terms of, velocity can be how much did we deliver throughout the sprint, regardless of whether a ticket was added at the start of the sprint or during the sprint's execution. Similarly for commitment, how much commitment could be how much did we start the sprint with versus how much did we actually end the sprint with. So if you think about this now, say you start a sprint with 10 tickets, that's what your planned commitment is. Things changed during the sprint and you had to add or commit to, say, 12 tickets in total, and you managed to complete all 12 of them. Now, in this kind of a scenario, when we're looking to calculate sprint capacity accuracy, we're looking to calculate velocity as your overall velocity divided by the commitment as just how much you had committed to the start of the sprint. Now, in that case, in this example, which I gave you, you would end up at 120% sprint capacity accuracy because you planned for 10, but you completed 12. Now, if you see this happening quite often, and you see this happening multiple times over a course of 3 or 4 sprints, then you know that your team's capacity is actually for 12 tickets. Why are you not planning for 12 at the start? So that's where, if you look at the quartiles and the way they're set up, the top quartile would be 91 to 109%. So you're ideally aiming for 100% in this scenario. Whereas the bottom quartile could be two different boundaries. So it's either under 70% or over 130%. So if you're on the under 70% side, that means you are way over planning a lot for your sprint and not being able to deliver on those plans or those commitments. Whereas if you're over 130%, then you're under planning. So that's the kind of balance you want to try and strike in terms of ensuring that you are reaching a good balance in terms of understanding what the true capacity of your team is. Sprint target complete. Yes, Will, sorry.
I was just going to say one point to mention there, just to throw in. I mean, it's fair to say that the sprint capacity accuracy, this metric in of itself, in some ways, is a reaction to sprint target completion, which you're going to jump into next, right?
Yeah, exactly. So sprint target completion is then, in the velocity versus commitment side of things, it's just how much of what we had initially planned did we actually complete, and that's where you kind of see these. It's to give you an understanding, of both the scope change and the sprint target completion. You will then be able to sort of work out what your capacity accuracy is. Like very simply, scope change does happen during a sprint. It's inevitable in most cases, and that's something where how you react to it is important, and then how that can give you a good understanding of what your actual capacity is. Now, coming to the sprint target completion side of things, this is something which we've seen, like the top quartile has remained roughly the same from the previous version of the benchmarks, but the bottom quartile has improved as well, going through this. So 70% or above is where you would kind of fall into the top quartile of our customers. But if you're below 52% and under 70% accuracy, then there's too much going into a sprint, and you should look to tone that down a little bit. Finally, the most surprising thing that we did see when we were doing these benchmarks was the amount of scope change that happens during a sprint. So even if you have 50% scope change, you end up in the top quartile of all of our customers, which was absolutely baffling to us. It's, it does go to show that people struggle with this quite a lot, and it's something where sticking to plan is becoming harder and harder for teams. Now, there's many ways that you can start to think about this as well. It's like, okay, maybe we try and reserve certain capacity, because if we know that this happens quite consistently, then we reserve some capacity for within when we're doing our planning to ensure that we do still meet our initial planned goals, but reserve some capacity to ensure that any unforeseen circumstances that we are able to respond to them. So that's the key takeaway from here is to, teams are still struggling to kind of plan and execute their sprints, but majority of the reasons for that is the lot of scope change that does happen during a sprint itself. And that's something which you need to try and improve upon by reviewing your processes and making some changes in terms of how things are brought into a particular sprint.
Yeah, I think we'll talk a little bit about this in the key takeaways as well. But I mean, I think one thing that stands out a little bit to us certainly is, Scrum is not easy, right? And teams are still struggling with some of the fundamentals of Scrum, but also still requiring a lot of support in terms of protecting the scope that they have. In theory, teams are enabled to be able to kind of define what their goals are, define the scope around that. But oftentimes they're not given the chance to kind of follow that all the way through after sprint after sprint after sprint. And we still see quite a significant amount, as Pranav said, of scope change that's impacting teams' ability. And I think there's no surprise there in some ways that the sprint target completion is as low as it is in some ways, because if your scope is changing, you're always going to have a hard time meeting the goals that you originally set for yourself. So it's definitely one that focuses the attention as we continue through 2025. Now, the last area is quality. And this is always the most controversial area when we talk to customers about it, because I think everything above it is pretty straightforward and pretty non-controversial. But people always have a lot of thoughts on the quality side. So we're going to walk through it a bit here. So bug resolution time. Again, this really it is as it sounds, right? How long does it take from a bug being identified for us to being able to resolve it? And I think the reason why this metric is so fundamentally important for teams, naturally you want to be responsive. And I think the initial instinct for a lot of teams is, well, we only care really about our P1s and our P2s, the things that are critical or high priority bugs. We want to make sure that we can resolve those as quickly as possible. But if it's a P3 or a P4, is that really as important as the other ones? Now, if the question that you're asking is just comparing this bug versus this story, well, naturally that story is always going to win out. But when you take this stretched out across time and you consider the fact that the longer it takes you to resolve bugs, the more costly it is for you to resolve those bugs, then it's actually a bit of a killer, the fact that actually it's the low priority bugs that you're disproportionately spending the majority amount of your cost on compared to what you could have done by fixing it quicker. And then also the fact that that time that you've invested there is also time that you've taken away from the ability to focus on more stories when you scale this out over this, of course, for a quarter or half a year or a full year. So it's always an interesting one. It's always a slightly controversial one. Our recommendation isn't just forget all of your stories and just focus on bugs, but it is to constantly remind ourselves of that delicate balance between not falling into the trap of just comparing one bug versus one story, but also trying to take a bigger picture, take the bigger picture in mind when you consider the fact that as we continue to devalue these individual bugs, right, then we will build up a backlog. It will be more expensive, and it will present the kind of biggest threat to us to be able to continuously deliver value to our customers and quote unquote be more productive in the way that you can actually focus on value delivery for your customers. The second one is around stories delivered and bugs raised. And this is a very simple ratio, which really works in a number of different ways. One is it's a good reminder, just in some basics of kind of, for every story that we deliver, how many bugs do we raise? Or, in this case, how many stories can we deliver before a bug is raised? Now, I think what's important here to think about is, we're not saying, there's a benefit in the gamification here, right? So, some people look at this metric and just say, okay, well, we'll just break our stories down. Yeah, that's kind of the point, because by breaking those stories down, you'll actually reduce the amount of defects that are created in the first place, because, naturally speaking, when you take a 8 and break it down into a 5, or you take 5s and break it down into a 3, or if you're not using story points, whatever estimate mechanism you're using, basically when you take that complexity and break it down, you're naturally improving the understanding, the knowledge of what needs to be delivered, what those dependencies are, and are increasing your chance of success of being able to iteratively build those changes into your code base and ship them into production. So what we do with this, I think, is it's really useful as a kind of a trend analysis piece. If you're finding that you're, creating more bugs than stories to deliver, there's probably a really good indication, not that you have to reduce the amount of bugs, but actually, conversely, there's probably more of an issue with your stories in the sense that they're too big. And they're too big in the sense that they're driving more complexity into how you're delivering, and that's going to result in a higher bug rate. And so by specifically trying to increase the amount of stories you delivered, even if that means, we're going to deliver functionally the same amount, or we're going to break that complexity down into smaller pieces, you're going to find that you're going to have a reduction in bugs that eventually pop up and delays that eventually pop up because you're breaking down that complexity and that risk overall. And then the last one, I think, is one that goes hand in hand with the bug resolution topic that we talked about earlier. And that was basically how many bugs are we resolving versus how many bugs are we raising. Okay. Now, naturally, if you're at 1-to-1, that means that for every bug that you resolve, you've created a new bug. And that basically means your bug backlog is staying flat. But if you're raising more bugs than you're resolving, then naturally that means that you have an increasing backlog, which means the age of your bugs are increasing. The cost of those bugs is naturally increasing over time. And at some point in time, you're going to have to pay that down, either by disproportionately focusing on bugs because you deferred them previously, or by having to do maybe a sprint or two or an iteration or two of a bug bash to then actually sort out that bug backlog to get yourself back into a more stable product. So I think it's a really good indicator for teams to think about. I'm not saying that every single sprint or every single iteration that you plan needs to be at exactly 1-to-1, or you need to resolve more bugs than you create. But as a general trend, it does provide a very good indicator for a team when they go into a planning exercise, to what extent are they considering bugs, which might, again, individually represent less value or less important than the counterpart story. But ultimately, they're thinking about this actively as we do want to mitigate this. We do want to avoid a forever increasing backlog of technical debt, which we're going to have to pay down. And that way we pay that down is going to be much more expensive to us in the future than it would be if we were quickly reactive short term. So those are the kind of three that wrap together the final quality side. Are there, I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A side of things. Are there any Q&A bits that we want to go through, Pranav?
If you just want to answer the one from anonymous attendee, I'm just replying to John's message.
Mr. Farr, I see you. All right, the anonymous attendee. So scope changes can be a result of inadequately defining user story and associated requirements. Are you creating any metrics to measure scope change as a result of user changing their minds or an inadequate user story definition? So that is a really good question. So actually, there is a metric in Plandek that does that, and it's slightly dependent on how you use Jira. And I'll give you an example. So when in our Jira configuration, we have two types of subtasks that we typically use underneath a story that we're delivering. Whether you're using Jira or ADO, it's the same concept, doesn't really matter. And what this does, we have a defect and we have a change. So when, I don't know, it could happen in development, it could happen in QA. If something has happened, which is causing a regression, right? If it's related to the requirements or the requirements changing or inadequately being defined, then that is raised as a change within Sprint so that we can actually see the cause of this regression was coming from a change as opposed to an actual defect itself. So this is a very easy way for you to be able to identify the point that you're talking about here, which is you're absolutely right. The scope changes can be a change of prioritization. It can be inadequately defined user stories in the first place or associated requirements. And this is one of the ways that you can definitely look at what is the impact and to what extent when we do see regressions or we do see problems in that part of the flow, how is that related to, maybe an inadequately defined requirement, or whether that's something related to an issue that we had actually with understanding of the requirement code base itself. I don't know if it's the same person. Is this data measured by the sprint, by the quarter, or an overall average?
This is for Q4 of 2024. So the data that you're seeing on my screen right now is for Q4 of 2024. We do this every quarter and ensure that you are constantly updating this because things will change from quarter to quarter, and that's what we do.
Okay, so that's done. 10 minutes left. I'm just conscious of time before we jump back in. Should we talk a little bit about the takeaways?
Yes. Let me start off. We're talking about the takeaways. The key thing again, from what we have seen, and I think this is something which a lot, we can all attest to a lot, is for us to improve our planning processes for sprints, and trying to minimize scope change as much as possible. Because as soon as you look to minimize your scope change, you will start to see more benefits, obviously, with your target completion going up. You will ideally be able to sort of understand also what your true capacity might be within your sprints. And that's something which is one of the most important things for us to look at following this version of the benchmarks is how can we reduce our scope change as much as possible during a particular sprint. And I think that's, if you start to do that, then you do have additional benefits, because I think once you reduce that scope change, you are moving the goalposts less. You are effectively also going to help your cycle time and lead time to value as well. And you will be a lot faster to be able to deliver.
Right. I think one of the things that I've noticed as well, and part of this is from the benchmarking exercise, part of it's from the delivery health checks that we do with our customers, is around sort of how people generally structure their data to enable them to answer questions around how time is broadly focused. And I talked a little bit about before around roadmap versus technical debt versus support maintenance versus client escalations. Whether that's the right model for you or whether you have different categories is something you need to really decide. Is probably something relatively around those four. But I think one of the things that I'd recommend to a lot of customers that we work with and others is to start thinking about, how do we start to set this up in a way that we get a better understanding of where is our time focus, but also within that, not only as it relates to the plan work, but also the context switching. There are still quite a lot of customers out there that use epics as buckets, and tactically speaking, I can understand why people do that. It makes sense. But from a different lens, when you're actually trying to see the distribution of where your focus is and how focused are we, makes it very, very difficult to spot that when buckets are forever open in the background and you're constantly working against them, because it essentially doesn't give you real clarity around how focused are we and are we focused in the right things going to drive value for our business. So that's one thing that I'd recommend to folks is to stop using epic buckets. I don't think there are better ways of being able to do that doesn't cloud your understanding of where you're focused. But also when you think about the investment categories yourself, really coming up with what are the 3 or 4 or 5, probably really shouldn't be more than 5. Otherwise you're at risk of kind of getting too finite in the detail. Categories that best represents, where you spend your time, and how that time then translates for potential value or potential cost for your business. And then start to think about how do you structure your data. And obviously we work with a lot of customers on this. We're more than always happy to have a conversation with you on how to do this. So you can translate that so you get a better understanding across different product areas, different teams, and also across your business. Just generally, how is our focus there in terms of value driving work and planned work versus unplanned work or things that are operating at a higher cost base. Right. You'd be surprised at the amount of customers that are shocked from day one to find out maybe 30 or 40% of their time and their focus is on support and maintenance or keeping the lights on activity, which then really starts to beg some questions around how effectively you're utilizing those resources and where they can repoint some of that effort upstream to reduce the amount of quality issues coming out the back end later.
Yeah, thank you, Will. And I think another key thing which I did see as well was, looking at the cycle time and lead time to value measures, it's quite clear that cycle time is typically ending up being around 25% or a quarter of your lead time to value. So in terms of being able to respond quickly to market changes and to changing needs, the ways that you can really move the needle is by focusing on your lead time to value. So ensuring that the time a ticket spends, from ideation through the measure where you can reduce the amount of time it spends in a sort of waiting or a backlog status, the faster you can be to sort of respond to these changes and get your features out to market a lot sooner. So always remember that's from what we are seeing right now, it's roughly a 25% sort of split from between cycle time and lead time to value. So if you are good at this on this side of things, the ways that you can look to improve is then to improve this measure as well, so that you can get your features out to customers faster.
I think one thing there's a few of you will roll your eyes. I think I know a few of you on the call right now who I know are rolling their eyes when I'm about to say this, but there's obviously been a lot of hype and discussion around generative and agentic AI tools. And somebody posed this question to me the other day, sort of a rhetorical question. Imagine you had 1,000 junior developers that you're about to gain in your team next week. how would you handle that? And how would you ensure that you can actually absorb that? And that in some ways, I mean, it's an oversimplification, but in some ways does represent the power potentially of Gen AI and agentic AI. And I know that we're still at different stages of that journey and playing around in different tools and different ways to understand how do we operationalize, how do we get value from these tools, how can we utilize them. But I think one thing that it makes us think a lot about is when you think about particularly speed in particular and the efficiencies and ability for that pipeline to deliver value to your customers as quickly as possible. The idea of being able, what these tools can potentially do, whether it's in 3 months or 6 months or 2 years from now, ultimately does focus the attention a lot on making sure that in particular speed that you have processes and pipelines that are able to really support that demand and supply of change that's going to come through that you can deliver more effectively to your customers.
Fantastic. I think one final question on the chat, Will, just to talking about planning in Scrum versus planning in Kanban.
Thoughts on that? I mean, that Tim, that is an entire webinar in of itself, my friend. But I will do my best. And we have 3 minutes remaining. I'll try to make it a 30-second or a 1 minute. Personally, for me, I think if it's important for your team to align with a broader plan, okay, generally speaking, Scrum is going to be far more effective than that because it does give you milestones that you can build into a plan. And I do believe that lends itself much better to that being able to sort of iteratively, build into an overarching plan that's going to help deliver. It doesn't mean that Kanban can't do it, but what Kanban does do is it presents a number of challenges in terms of the lack of controls naturally within the process, but also a focus on being able to drive real consistency, not only in terms of how you estimate and scope out your work, so that you can then have a good ability to be able to project, what is our throughput? Well, if everything has different sizes massively, then throughput is a pretty meaningless point. But with Kanban, you have to understand your input and your output ratios, how you're identifying and removing flow along the process, and how you're equal sizing a lot of those tickets, that when you say, okay, well, this month we're going to deliver X, that X actually translates into something that can fit into a plan, right? And so it's not to say that Kanban can't do it, but it does put a lot of burden on teams to be, I would say, a lot more professionalized and efficient in the way that they've actually reduced flow, sized their tickets, and can drive much more consistency and balance that input-output ratios. Whereas Scrum gives you a model, I think, that's a little bit better from a planning perspective. So you can actually plan 2 weeks, execute those 2 weeks, do a quick lessons learned, and then move on to the next 2 weeks, and you can iterate on that basis. That's my personal feeling on it. Maybe I've been around for too long that I'm slightly jaded in that. But I do think that the strengths of Scrum lend itself much more to that model, whereas Kanban is much more effective at being able to just burn down a very strong backlog and being able to push that into production more efficiently in that side of things, rather than trying to align with an overall planning activity. That was 2 minutes, not 30 seconds. So
you got there. Stop presenting.
Anything else that you want to mention, Pranav, before we close things off for the day?
No, just a massive thank you to everyone attending. This was really great, some really good questions. I hope we managed to get to most of them. We will share across these the document which we were presenting as well today. But please, there's a link in the chat where you can go in and also retrieve that and download that straight away right now.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, thank you everyone as well for taking the time out today. I appreciate it. No, you're all very busy. It's a Thursday afternoon, so I do appreciate the time you've invested with us all. If there's any questions that you have, do feel free to reach out to Pranav or myself. You can reach out to us through Plandek. There's a little chat box in the bottom right-hand corner that we're around. You can easily reach us through there. On LinkedIn, both of us are there. So, there's a number of different ways that you can reach out to us. So we look forward to it. If you have more general questions, the easiest way is just to ping us at hello@plandek.com. And one of us will pick up on that as well. So loads of ways of reaching out. So thank you very much today. Appreciate it. We'll make the video available for everyone. We'll also, as Pranav said, circulate the presentation that we went through today. There's actually a lot more to it. But we just kept it kind of high level on the summary page. So thank you very much, everyone. And we will hopefully speak to you very soon.
Yes, guys. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.